What if the moon knows you better than you know yourself? There's a part of you that existed before you had words for it, before you learned how to explain yourself, before you developed the personality that you present to the world, before you understood what was acceptable to feel and what was better kept hidden, before the long process of socialization shaped you into someone who could function in a family, in a classroom, in a workplace, in a culture that had very specific ideas about who you should be and how you should behave. Before all of that, something was already present. A way of feeling, a way of needing, a way of responding to the world that was not chosen, not learned, not constructed from experience. Something that simply was, as immediate and as prior as the body itself. Something that still operates beneath every persona you have ever worn, beneath every strategy you have ever developed, beneath every story you have ever told about yourself. That something is what astrology calls the moon, and it may know you better than you know yourself. Because the moon in the birth chart does not represent who you are becoming. That is the sun. It represents who you already are at the most instinctive, most automatic, most pre-reflective level. The emotional patterns that run beneath conscious awareness. The needs that assert themselves whether or not you want them to. The ways of responding to threat, to love, to loss, to belonging, that were established so early, so deeply, so far below the threshold of choice, that most people experience them not as patterns, but as simply the way things are. The moon is the emotional body, the inner child, the part of you that knows, before the mind has formed an opinion, whether a situation feels safe or dangerous, familiar or foreign, nourishing or depleting. In traditional astrology, the moon governs several interconnected things. The emotional nature, not just what you feel, but how you feel. The texture and rhythm and depth of your emotional life. The instincts, the automatic responses that happen before reflection. The gut reactions that bypass the thinking mind entirely. The relationship with the mother, or more precisely, with the experience of being mothered. The early relational environment that taught you, before you had language, what love felt like, what safety felt like, whether the world was reliable or unpredictable, whether your needs would be met or whether you would have to find other ways to manage them. And the relationship with home, not just the physical place, but the internal sense of belonging, of being held, of being somewhere that is truly yours. All of this is encoded in the moon sign. And because it was encoded so early, before the ego had developed enough to observe, to question, to choose, it operates largely outside of awareness. Most people do not know their moon. They know their reactions. They know the feeling of being triggered without understanding why. They know the particular flavor of loneliness or comfort or anxiety that recurs throughout their lives with a consistency that seems almost faded. They know the things that make them feel immediately, instinctively at home, and the things that make them feel immediately, instinctively unsafe. But they rarely connect these patterns to a coherent underlying structure. The moon in the birth chart makes that structure visible. Because each moon sign describes not just an emotional style, but an emotional need, a specific quality of experience that the inner life requires in order to feel safe, nourished, and whole. And when that need is not met, when the circumstances of life consistently fail to provide what the moon requires, the result is not just discomfort. It is a specific kind of emotional hunger that cannot be satisfied by anything other than what it actually needs. Moon in Aries needs freedom of emotional expression, the capacity to feel without being managed, to respond without being controlled, to move through emotional states at its own pace rather than the pace others find comfortable. When this need is consistently frustrated, when the emotional environment demands suppression, patience, consideration of others before self, the result is a particular kind of rage that has nowhere to go, a restlessness that cannot settle, an emotional volatility that looks like instability but is actually frustrated aliveness. Moon in Taurus needs consistency, beauty, and sensory comfort. The inner life of this moon is nourished by stability, by environments that do not change unpredictably, by physical comfort that signals that the world is safe, by the slow and unhurried pleasure of things that are simply good. When this need is frustrated, when life is characterized by constant upheaval, financial instability, or emotional unpredictability, the result is a stubbornness that is really the psyche's attempt to create stability in the only way it knows how. Moon in Gemini needs mental stimulation and emotional variety. The inner life of this moon does not process feelings by sitting with them. It processes them by talking, by moving between perspectives, by finding the intellectual frame that makes emotional experience comprehensible. When this need is frustrated, when the emotional environment demands depth and stillness and consistency, the result is a restlessness that looks like emotional shallowness, but is actually an unmet need for a particular kind of mental and emotional freedom. Moon in Cancer is the moon in its own home. This is the sign the moon rules, and its needs here are both the most instinctive and the most recognizable. The deep need for belonging, for emotional safety, for a home that is genuinely a refuge. The inner life of this moon is extraordinarily sensitive to emotional atmosphere. It absorbs the feelings of others almost involuntarily and requires a safe container in which its own feelings can be expressed without judgment. When this need is frustrated, when the early environment was emotionally unsafe or unpredictable, the result is a clinginess or a withdrawal that is really the psyche trying to protect something that never felt truly safe. Moon in Leo needs to be seen, not in a superficial way, but in the deep sense of being recognized, appreciated, valued for what is genuinely and specifically one's own. The inner life of this moon is nourished by warmth, by genuine appreciation, by environments in which its particular way of being is celebrated rather than merely tolerated. When this need is frustrated, when the early environment was critical, dismissive, or simply inattentive, the result is a performance that is really a search for the recognition that was missing, a drama that is really an unanswered question about worth. Moon in Virgo needs order, usefulness, and the sense that it is contributing something real. The inner life of this moon is not comfortable with ambiguity or chaos. It processes emotional experience by analyzing it, by finding the practical lesson, by converting feeling into something that can be acted upon and improved. When this need is frustrated, when the emotional environment is chaotic or demands a kind of emotional expressiveness that feels unsafe, the result is a critical perfectionism that is really the psyche's attempt to create control in a world that feels unreliable. Moon in Libra needs harmony, beauty, and genuine connection. The inner life of this moon is deeply attuned to relationship. It feels most itself in the presence of genuine reciprocity, of emotional balance, of environments in which everyone is considered and no one is overlooked. When this need is frustrated, when the early environment was conflictual or demanding, or consistently put the moon in Libra's needs last, the result is a people-pleasing that is really the psyche's attempt to create the harmony it needs in the only way that seemed available. Moon in Scorpio needs depth, honesty, and emotional intensity. The inner life of this moon is not nourished by surface. It requires real contact, real vulnerability, real encounters with what is true rather than what is comfortable. When this need is frustrated, when the emotional environment rewards suppression over expression, performance over authenticity, control over genuine feeling, the result is a suspicion and a guardedness that is really the psyche protecting something that learned very early that it was not safe to be fully known. Moon in Sagittarius needs freedom, meaning, and the sense that life is an adventure rather than a constraint. The inner life of this moon is nourished by expansion, by new experiences, new ideas, new horizons that keep the emotional world from contracting into something too small and too familiar. When this need is frustrated, when circumstances demand limitation, routine, or the suppression of the natural buoyancy of this moon, The result is a restlessness that is really an unmet need for the kind of freedom that makes life feel genuinely worth living. Moon in Capricorn needs structure, achievement, and emotional self-sufficiency. The inner life of this moon is not comfortable with dependency or with the expression of need. It was formed often in environments where emotional needs were either not acknowledged or were actively discouraged, and it learned very early to be its own source of security. When the needs of this moon are frustrated, when the emotional environment demands vulnerability that feels dangerous, the result is a coldness or a distance that is really the psyche protecting itself from a kind of exposure that it learned was not safe. Moon in Aquarius needs freedom from emotional expectation and the sense of being part of something larger than the personal. The inner life of this moon processes feeling through detachment, through the intellectual frame, through the larger pattern, through the sense that individual emotional experience is one node in a much larger network. When this need is frustrated, when the emotional environment demands personal intimacy that feels suffocating, the result is an emotional unavailability that is really the psyche protecting its need for a particular kind of freedom. Moon in Pisces needs dissolution, compassion, and the sense of connection to something beyond the ordinary. The inner life of this moon is extraordinarily permeable. It absorbs emotional atmosphere the way a sponge absorbs water, and it requires regular periods of solitude and stillness to process what it has taken in. When this need is frustrated, when the emotional environment is harsh, demanding, or consistently fails to honor the sensitivity of this moon, the result is a confusion or a dissociation that is really the psyche retreating from a world that feels too sharp and too loud. These are not weaknesses, they are needs. And the single most important thing you can do with your moon sign is not to overcome it, not to transcend it, not to use the sun's direction to escape from it, but to understand it, to recognize the emotional hunger that has been driving behavior for as long as you can remember, to see perhaps for the first time that what looked like a flaw, the neediness, the volatility, the withdrawal, the perfectionism, the performance, was always an unmet need wearing a disguise. Because a need that is understood can be met, and a need that is met does not have to become a pattern. The moon does not ask you to change who you are at the most instinctive level. It asks you to finally see it, clearly, without judgment, and with enough compassion for the part of you that learned, very early and very deeply, that the world was the way it was, and responded the only way it knew how. And in the next video, we will explore the third element of the birth chart that most people have never examined, the one that governs not who you are becoming or who you already are, but how you arrive. The face you show the world before it knows you. The door through which you enter every new situation, every new relationship, every new beginning, the rising sign.